24 Jahre lang in einem Keller sein, eingesperrt, gemacht sowas. Wahnsinn.
On April 19th, 2008, the hospital got an emergency call saying a girl needed urgent care. She was pale, with blood on her lips, and her condition was critical. Doctors found her kidney failure was severe and she was in life-threatening condition. When they asked the man who brought her in about her medical history, he didn't know much. He said he was her grandfather, Joseph Fritzl, and explained that the girl was his granddaughter, Christina. Her mother, Elizabeth, couldn't take care of her anymore, so she sent her back. That morning, when Joseph opened his door, he found Christina lying on the ground outside, pale and weak, blood on her lips. Next to her was a letter. And when Joseph picked it up, he learned that Christina was his daughter, Elizabeth's child. The letter said that Christina's condition was critical and Elizabeth couldn't take care of her, so she hoped the family could help. Joseph rushed Christina to the hospital, but since they didn't know her medical history, they asked the police to help find her mother. They needed more details about her condition and family history to give her the right treatment. The police found that the postmark on the letter came from a town 70 kilometers away. The police started investigating and quickly found Kirsten. She had no records at all, no birth certificate, no traces of her life. And her mother, Elizabeth. No sign of her either. The story quickly made headlines on Austrian TV. They asked the public to help find Elizabeth and encouraged her to come forward to save her daughter. Not long after, Joseph claimed he found Elizabeth, who had been missing for 24 years, and brought her to the hospital. When the doctor spoke with her, he noticed her eyes were shifting around. She looked lifeless, and most shockingly, there were clear signs of abuse on her body. The doctor didn't hesitate. He called the police. When the police first saw Elizabeth, they were shocked. At 42, she looked like she was 60. She was severely malnourished. Her hair was grey and her skin was pale with no colour. At first, no matter how much the police asked, she wouldn't say anything. Her first words when she saw the police were, "No one will believe me." Only after the police separated her from Joseph did she start talking. She kept asking one question: "Do I really never have to see him again? Can you guarantee my child and I are safe?" After they reassured her, she finally trembled and spoke about the 24 years of suffering. It all started on August 28, 1984. Joseph was renovating the wine cellar, trying to install a new door. He couldn't do it alone, so he asked 18-year-old Elizabeth to help. After she helped get the door in place and was about to leave, Joseph covered her face with a towel soaked in something, and she passed out. When she woke up, she found herself locked in a small, dark room. No matter how much she shouted, there was no answer. She screamed, hoping someone, family or neighbors, would hear her and help. But no one heard. A few days later, she gave up. She knew it was useless. Besides her father, no one knew about this room's existence. No one knew the code on the door. And so Elizabeth began her 24 years in the dark. The next day, after Elizabeth was locked in the room, her mum reported her missing to the police. Even though it was the third time she'd run away, her mum was still really worried. She rushed to file a missing person report, hoping to bring her daughter home. The police started looking into it, but they didn't find any leads. A month later, her mom received a letter. In the letter, Elizabeth begged her not to search for her anymore. She said she was fed up with family life, so she decided to leave and asked her parents and the police to stop looking for her. When the police came back to Elizabeth's house, Joseph told them he had no idea where she went, but he did say that before she disappeared, she had mentioned joining a cult group. This was all part of Joseph's plan. He drugged Elizabeth, making it look like she had vanished. To cover his tracks, he told his wife Elizabeth had joined a cult and ran away, and he also made up a story about her disappearance for the police. The police had no clue that Elizabeth was only about 6 meters away from them. After being locked in the room, Elizabeth was tied to a column, like some kind of animal being punished. She could only go to the bathroom around the column. On the second day of her captivity, her father raped her. Elizabeth later admitted to the police that this wasn't the first time her father had done this. She said that when she was in middle school, her father started to rape her. At that time, she was too young to understand what was happening. As she got older, he wouldn't let her go out at night and didn't allow her to invite friends over, trying to control every part of her life. That's when she started to rebel. She ran away twice, but both times the police found her and brought her back. Her attempts to run away made her the bad kid in everyone's eyes, a troublemaker who wouldn't listen to her parents. In the end, she ended up in an even worse situation. After being locked in the room, at first, she tried to resist, but that only led to more torture and longer periods of hunger. Eventually, she became numb. She started doing whatever her father wanted. She did it just to stay alive. For the next few years, Joseph would only bring her food and basic supplies, but he also kept forcing her to endure cruel abuse. He never spoke during any of it. When it was done, he just left. They never talked. For Elizabeth, just starting out in life, this was the darkest, most hopeless time. For the next 24 years, she kept enduring the same treatment. Joseph never took precautions. Sometimes he'd bring adult videos into the room and force her to act out the scenes. He would threaten her, telling her if she tried to escape or fight back, he'd kill her mother with poison or electricity. Elizabeth knew there was no way to fight back. She had to cooperate to survive. When Elizabeth first noticed her stomach growing, she was terrified. Even 2 months before the baby was due, Joseph still didn't take her to the hospital. He just gave her an old parenting book. The worst part was, right before she went into labor, Joseph brought in a blanket, a pair of scissors and some diapers. He just left her to give birth on her own. 10 days after her daughter was born, Joseph finally came to see them. After Elizabeth gave birth, Joseph didn't stop. He even did it in front of the child. If the kids misbehaved, he'd punish them with electric shocks. He'd threaten to suck all the air out of the underground room and make them disappear completely. In that dark, windowless room, Elizabeth had 7 children. One of her sons became seriously ill shortly after he was born. But Joseph didn't want a doctor involved. He was afraid of being caught, so Elizabeth had to watch her son die, helpless. Joseph disposed of the baby's body by throwing it into the furnace. 3 of the other children were taken out, each with a letter Elizabeth was forced to write. In the letter, she said she couldn't care for them, so Joseph adopted them, no questions asked. When they were a little older, he sent them to school for a proper education. The remaining 3 children stayed with Elizabeth in the underground room. The room had no sunlight, no heating, and no fresh air. There was barely any room to move around. They were confined, only able to stay by the walls or door. It was dark and damp, full of mold, and overrun with rats. The smell was unbearable. For the first 9 years, Elizabeth and the children were trapped there. As more children were born, Joseph built 2 additional rooms. He added ventilation, an oven, and a fridge. Elizabeth told the police that Joseph often cut the power, sometimes leaving them without electricity for 10 days at a time. That meant they had to eat cold food and shower with cold water. Joseph would come to see them from time to time. Elizabeth had to ration their food carefully, or else they would starve. The children frequently fell sick, but couldn't get treated. Joseph only brought cough medicine or painkillers, letting them suffer. He frequently threatened Elizabeth, saying that if she didn't obey him, things would only get worse. He also told her they could never escape. He set up traps so that if they tried to run, poison gas would kill them. He said he'd rather kill everyone in the room than let the truth come out, and if they didn't follow his orders, he'd lock them in and make them vanish. It wasn't until Christina, their 19-year-old daughter, became seriously ill that Elizabeth begged Joseph to help. Only then did he take her to the hospital. He told the doctor he found Christina abandoned at his doorstep. Elizabeth had run away 24 years ago. This is where Joseph's carefully crafted story began. Elizabeth was locked away for 24 years. When she came back, she was 42 years old. She was frail, her cheekbones were sticking out. Her hair was dull, and her skin was pale and lifeless. The kids, having been locked up so long, had some serious health issues. They couldn't get out, so they didn't have the chance to build up immunity or get natural sunlight. They suffered from vitamin deficiencies, anemia, and some even started losing their teeth. When they finally stepped outside, it was overwhelming. The two younger kids who had never seen the outside world were scared and confused by everything. The sunlight, the fresh air, the breeze, the noise of the city and the cars, all of it was too much. Did Joseph make any mistakes during those 24 years? Of course, some of his former tenants came forward. They said they'd heard and seen strange things in the house. One tenant, who lived above the basement for 4 years, said Joseph was often gone, and though there was no washing machine, the electricity bill was unusually high. He also noticed food in the kitchen would mysteriously disappear. Joseph had keys to every room. He also forbade the tenants from going near the garden or the basement. Only later did they realize the garden led directly to the basement. Another tenant, who had lived there for 12 years, said he sometimes heard strange noises from below. Joseph claimed it was just the heating system. One of Joseph's friends also told the police that they'd gone on vacation to Asia together a couple of times, and Joseph had bought women's underwear, but the size was clearly not for his wife. The police later found out that Joseph had a criminal record. He had once broken into a 24-year-old nurse's home, held a knife to her throat and assaulted her. He also tried to assault a 21-year-old woman and got an 18-month sentence for it. In Austria, criminal records are wiped clean after 15 years. So years later, Joseph managed to present himself as a good husband again. In 2009, the trial finally started. Joseph showed up in court as the defendant. He kept his face covered with a prison folder. When he came back to court on March 17th, reporters captured his expression. It showed clear contempt. He seemed to have no idea just how serious his actions were. A British crime reporter, Pelly, said that when he spoke to Joseph and his lawyer, he felt no remorse from Joseph. He said he had never met someone so terrifying. To protect the victims, the trial was closed to the public. Elizabeth and the children only testified through recorded videos. The court showed Elizabeth's 13-hour testimony the next day, since Austria abolished the death penalty. If Joseph was found guilty of all charges, he could face life in prison. During the trial, Joseph followed his lawyer's advice and stayed silent. His lawyer said Joseph admitted to most of the charges, like illegal confinement and ethical violations. But Joseph denied the charges of murder and enslavement. He didn't want to spend his life in prison, so he hoped for a reduced sentence of 15 years. DNA tests were done on the 6 children, and the results confirmed Joseph was their biological father. After reviewing all the evidence, the court sentenced Joseph to life in prison. In 2009, Joseph accepted the verdict and said he wouldn't appeal. It was hard to believe someone could do something so unethical. How could a father do that? During the trial, a psychologist assessed Joseph. The report showed he had a serious power complex, likely from the abuse he suffered from his mother as a child. Before this, most neighbors thought Joseph was a good guy, a good dad, a good husband. He had a clear plan for his life. He studied electronics in technical school, then worked at a steel company. At 21, he married 17-year-old Rosemary, and they had 7 kids. Later, he quit the steel company and joined a building materials business. His boss called him smart and kind. Then he moved to a sales job at a German company. By 1973, he and his wife bought a guest house in the mountains, making a living from it. With steady income, he bought more properties and rented out their villa. He chose Elizabeth out of all his kids because she was the most like him, stubborn and strong. The stronger the opponent, the more he enjoyed the feeling of conquest. As he grew older, Joseph locked his mother in a room, sealed the windows with bricks, and kept her from leaving until she died. Clearly, Joseph's mind had twisted long ago, and his actions showed it from the start. Now, years after the shocking case, Elizabeth, 53, lives with her 6 kids and her mother, still receiving therapy, and her health is slowly improving. They're struggling but staying hopeful, trying to fit back into the world, hoping to move on from the pain they suffered.